Here is test, here is test. Signal if you can hear my voice. Signal if you can hear my voice. Behind me is the landscape of modern Prague, and it seems to me Prague is a city which participated in one of the most important bifurcations in the history of Western thought. A little background may be necessary. The Emperor Rudolph II was chosen by the electors of the Northern League, and at his death they chose from among themselves a new emperor, in this case Frederick, Prince Palatine of Heidelberg, who had recently married Elizabeth, the daughter of James of England. Frederick the Elector assumed that the King of England giving his daughter's hand in marriage signaled approval for Frederick's visionary plan for an alchemical kingdom in Central Europe to be ruled by himself from Prague. And to this end, Frederick transferred his court from Heidelberg to Prague in the fall of 1619. This is a historical episode that has become known as the incident of the Winter King and Queen. Frederick the Elector Palatine of Bohemia and his queen, Elizabeth, ruled for nearly a year from Prague and brought with them the alchemists of Heidelberg. Personalities such as Michael Meyer, Johannes Andrei, and Heinrich Kunrath graced their court. But the alchemical fantasies of Frederick the Elector Palatine of Bohemia and his queen were destined to fail, for by the early spring of 1620, a local bishop had raised an army and had been joined by Habsburg troops who laid siege to Prague. And that siege, after a number of weeks, succeeded. Among those taking part in the siege was a young French soldier who had been wenching and traveling across Europe in the style of the times, Rene Descartes, destined to be the founder of modern scientific materialism. I like to think that perhaps Descartes actually encountered his bête noire, Michael Meyer, Prince of Alchemists, in the confused situation that prevailed when Prague fell. For Meyer was lost in the siege of Prague, never to be heard from again. It's instances like this in the history of European thought that have inspired a group of American thinkers to form the Bohemian Institute of Prague, a think tank, theater group, and video production center to be established here in Prague and to celebrate the occult and spiritual heritage of this great city, a city which, had its alchemical visions been completed, modernity would have been a far different affair.
Terence.
Micky.
Well, Terence, what if there had been a different story? What if, in the duel between Michael Meyer and Rene Descartes that you've envisaged, it's not Meyer who dies, but Meyer who blows a near-fatal hit to Descartes. And Descartes experiences a near-death experience in which he sees not only in a panoramic view, as we all know what happens at a near-death experience, his own life, but he experiences his own future and the future of the world that would have happened if his principles, his ideas, his influence on the scientific, mechanical world would have been as big as we imagine it has been on the point where we're sitting now.
Are you saying we're trapped inside Rene Descartes' near-death experience, Micky?
You're dead right, in the near-death experience. All these characters, myself and you included, we are just actors inside Descartes' brain. And as we all know, near-death experiences show in near-death experiences a lot of tryptamine shows up in the brain. So I believe we are just part of a tryptamine near-death trip of Rene Descartes in the year 1620. Now, there is, of course, an itch to it.
Yes.
How do you
on,
feel?
maestro.
Right. Okay, now, at a certain point, maybe through the ingestion of tryptamine compounds in our brains, we become aware of the fact that this is not reality, but this is the interior design of Descartes' near-death experience. So we may become aware of this. Well, if he's just imagining this as things could have been, but as they also may not happen, well, what if we return, come to life with Rene Descartes? I mean, we are bleeding all over the place. Michael Meyer is kind enough to nurture Descartes back to health. And in fact, Descartes and Meyer strike this interesting relationship where one learns from the other. And I mean, there's been a lot of Descartes bashing in the kind of transpersonal movement. So what if Descartes had really something to contribute? And what if what he had to contribute would really well fit together with the alchemical quest, except now it's got a different framework. And so as we come back, Descartes is coming back to life, cooperating with Michael Meyer. They then have a chance to really rewrite history at this point of bifurcation and rewrite it in such a way that if we were on this parallel string of events, we could now look back and say, well, what if the 30-year war had actually happened? Putting us in a position where it never happened. Now, why did it not happen? My suggestion is Descartes fell in love with a woman here. Maybe it was the daughter of Rabbi Löw. And instead of having this 30-year war between two denominations of the Christian faith in their atavistic, patriarchal, women-debasing way, I could imagine that instead you have a black goddess cult developing instead, where the icon of the sacred marriage of women and of woman and man becomes the icon of a spiritual practice, center of which becomes the Black Lady of Loretto. Now we have a Loretto chapel here, a Loretto church here in Prague, which is very beautiful. And so we could imagine the string of history as it departs from the way we thought we know it, where the papacy becomes more and more cultish and insignificant, and the Pope just sort of a rambling guru who's walking down the streets of Rome, whereas the spiritual power shifts to this female black goddess worship, maybe with a female Pope, right here in Prague. Now, as this unrolls, of course, all that needed to happen to get us into our predicament would have taken a different course. We would have had alchemical modernity, a project whose time has definitely come. Probably by the beginning of the or the end of the 18th century, we would have been able to travel to the moon and have a sacred marriage somewhere in space based on not the exploitation of nature, but of the modern alchemical cooperation between mind, spirit, and matter. So, all of this is to say, as we are awaking from Descartes' nightmare, and as Descartes himself awakes from his own nightmare, we may be at a point where we are well advised to think up, well, what do we need if the good ideas of alchemy, modernity, spiritual marriage, feminine culture, partnership versions of history, if they were no longer just an occult underground bohemian dream, but if they were the ingredients of a mainstream civilization that decides to take a different course than the one we find ourselves in right now.
Well, you're wound up on this, I can tell. It's certainly an interesting idea. I mean, it's not clear to me how closely linked the evolution of modern science and the wars of religion that the 30 Years' War represented were. I mean, some people might say, had there been no 30 Years' War, there still would have been a Newton, there still would have been a Copernicus. But I suspect that you're probably right, that the 30 Years' War somehow exhausted the medieval eschatology, and people were then ready for new forms of governments, new forms of social order. One of the reasons that I'm so keen to establish the Bohemian Institute here in Prague is because you really put your finger on it. I have the feeling that this is a kind of more than simply a city, but a kind of dimensional portal or nexus, and that many different futures beckon off the Prague nexus. I mean, we had the potential democracy of Jan Margarak in the 20s, the communist period, which now appears like a dream. It's like it never happened. So this seems to be a city where historicity and dream easily change places.
And many strange appearances and figures show up in this dream. I mean, you hear them coming right and left.
Well, the Prague was the European Jerusalem, and may be so again, because I think what Prague really represented was an equal sensitivity to spirit and matter. That what alchemy meant was the union of spirit and matter, and the secular chemistry that arose out of Cartesian thinking was just thoroughly materialistic. So you're right. The kinds of speculations that you're indulging in would be precisely the kinds of concerns that the Bohemian Institute would concern itself with. Because I think when we come back and stand in these historically pivotal places, then with sufficient vision and imagination, we can probably send history careening off in a slightly different direction.
All right. Well, then let's kiss this sleeping beauty awake.
Hey, I'm all for it. I would love to see the Prague Renaissance take place.
Okay,
Here's
we go.
to it. Alchemy is an ancient art, one of the magical arts associated with dyeing and the gilding of metals, and tracing its origins back to ancient Egypt. But its modern culmination is here in the city of Prague, where in the 16th century, under the patronage of the Emperor Rudolf, the great alchemists of Europe gathered and pursued their art. Including Kepler. Alchemy is more than a technique for the conversion of base metals into gold. It is the culminating metaphor in the search for a union of spirit and matter. And whether or not this union was ever achieved is as mysterious as much of the rest of this ancient city. But whatever the success of the alchemists, they provide us with a metaphor for spiritual transformation that is extraordinarily applicable in the modern era. It was for this reason that the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung made alchemical motifs as important a part of his theory of the unconscious as the contents of dreams or folklore. You see, before modern science, the separation between observer and observed was more naively understood than in our own world. And the alchemist, staring into the swirling content of his retorts and his alembics, was seeing in his own imagination not the processes of natural chemistry, but an intermingling of psychological processes and material processes in a domain of epistemic confusion that we have grown distant from. Nevertheless, the legacy of our own science is one of pollution of the earth, toxification of the oceans. Something has been lost from the Western vision of nature by the exclusion of the notion of spirit. And it's fitting that in an effort to recapture that lost something, we return to Prague, the center of European occult thinking and a beacon to any future thinking on these matters. Dot. Dot. Okay, I don't know. There's a lot you could say that wasn't said there, that's for sure.